50-foot block of impossible black stone appeared in a city park. I was the only one who knew where it came from. My other self, the one who works while I sleep, had delivered it. My name is Thomas, and for the past month, my waking life has been a lie, a thin, fragile veneer over a truth I was not yet equipped to comprehend. I wake up every morning in my small, sterile apartment, feeling a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee can penetrate. It is a weariness that settles not in the muscles, but in the marrow, a cellular fatigue that speaks of immense, unremembered labor. My muscles ache with the dull throb of overexertion. My back is a latticework of phantom pains, and my hands, no matter how meticulously I scrub them, always seem to have a fine, dark grit lodged deep under the fingernails. I cycled through the rationalizations of a modern man, stress, a vitamin deficiency, the lingering effects of some undiagnosed flu, the simple, grinding price of living alone in a city that feeds on solitude. It was a regular day of being tired, a regular day of muscle aches and a growing, gnawing confusion that my life was no longer entirely my own. It was a regular day until I saw the handprint, and all my rationalizations crumbled into dust. I had just levered myself out of bed, my body feeling like a poorly piloted machine rented for the night, when I turned back to straighten the crumpled sheets. And there, on the crisp, white pillowcase, right next to the deep, circular indentation where my head had been, was a perfect, black handprint. It was not ink or paint. It was a fine, dark, sooty powder, like ash or pulverized stone. And the print was so stark and clear against the white fabric that I could see the whorls of the fingertips, the faint crease lines of the palm. It was my hand. I knew it with an instinctive, chilling certainty. My first thought was a surge of pure, ice-cold adrenaline that momentarily erased all fatigue. An intruder. Someone had been in my room. Someone had stood over me, inches from my face, watching me sleep. I tore through my small apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, silent search for a sign of entry. But the heavy deadbolt on the front door was still thrown from the inside. The security latch was engaged. The window locks were all secure. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place. There was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the single, impossible, black handprint on my pillow, a silent testament to a visitor who had never entered and had never left. The fear of an intruder, as terrifying as it was, at least obeyed the laws of physics. But as I stood there, staring at the print, a new, more insidious terror began to creep in, a fear of my own mind. Had I done this myself? Was I losing time, succumbing to some strange, nocturnal fugue state? The thought was almost worse than an intruder. The monster wasn't at the door. It was already inside. It was me. The discovery of the handprint shattered the mundane rhythm of my life. Sleep, once a welcome escape, became a source of profound anxiety. I began to fear my own bed, seeing it as a stage for a nightly performance I could neither remember nor control. Every morning for a week, the ritual repeated itself with terrifying consistency. The deep, cellular exhaustion, the phantom aches of a body pushed to its limits, and the fresh, dark handprint on the pillow, a mocking signature from my unconscious self. I tried staying awake, fueled by caffeine and cheap energy drinks. My apartment, a brightly lit fortress against the coming night. But by the third day, my body betrayed me. I passed out on my couch and woke up hours later with a crick in my neck, a fine black dust on the sofa cushion, and the horrifying knowledge that even escaping my bed couldn't stop my nightly pilgrimage. The walls of my own home were no longer a sanctuary. They were porous, permeable to a version of me I did not know. Desperate for answers, I bought a cheap motion-activated security camera. Setting it up on my bookshelf, aimed at the bed, felt like laying a trap for my own soul. I went to sleep that night, my mind a churning sea of dread and a perverse, desperate curiosity. When I awoke, the exhaustion was heavier than ever. My hands felt raw, the skin around my knuckles scraped and bruised, and the handprint was there. My heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. I pulled the memory card from the camera and slid it into my laptop. I scrolled through hours of mundane, time-stamped footage of me tossing and turning. Then, at exactly 3:03 a.m., the image changed. My sleeping body did not wake up. It sat up, its movements unnervingly smooth, devoid of the usual sleepy hesitation. It moved with a serene, absolute purpose, its eyes still closed, as if in a deep trance. This sleepwalking version of me stood, turned, and walked not to the door, but to the blank, solid wall at the foot of my bed. It raised a hand, placed it flat against the plaster, and then, with no sound, no flash of light, no special effect, it simply stepped through the wall, its form dissolving into the plaster, like a ghost passing through smoke. The wall rippled for a single, silent moment, like the surface of dark water, and then was solid again. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as the camera recorded the empty, silent room for 4 solid hours. Then, just as the first hint of dawn began to grey the window, my form stepped back out of the solid wall. It was covered in a fine black dust, and it moved with a weary stiffness. It got into bed, laid its head on the pillow, placed its dusty hand beside its face for a moment, leaving the now familiar print, and then settled into a deep, motionless sleep. I was not just sleepwalking, I was leaving reality as I knew it. But the footage revealed something new, a detail so small and strange it almost felt insignificant. As my other self stepped back into the room, a tiny, dark object fell from its pocket onto the floor, rolling under the bed. I hadn't noticed it this morning. My hands trembling, I got on my knees and aimed my phone's flashlight into the dusty space under my bed. There, nestled against the skirting board, was a small, smooth, black stone, carved into a perfect, sharp-edged triangle. It was cool to the touch and felt impossibly dense, heavy. It was a piece of the place I visited, and it was the first tangible clue I had. Holding it, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo a place far beyond the walls of my small, suddenly insignificant apartment. The small, triangular stone became the focal point of my waking existence. It was a tangible piece of my nightmare, a cold, hard fact in a life that was rapidly dissolving into inexplicable fatigue and paranoia. I kept it in my pocket, its impossible density a constant, unsettling reminder against my leg. Its faint, low hum was no longer just a physical vibration. It felt like it had seeped into my mind, a subconscious drone that hummed beneath my own thoughts. The nightly excursions were taking a greater toll. I was growing pale, gaunt. Dark circles, like bruises, formed under my eyes. Sometimes I would wake up with the taste of dust and ozone in my mouth, or with fleeting, fragmented images flashing behind my eyelids. the oppressive scale of a vast dark space, the rhythmic agony of a muscle tearing, the cold, smooth texture of obsidian. It was a sensory bleed-through, the experiences of my other self leaking into the waking world, poisoning my reality. My research into my own condition led me down a rabbit hole of neurological disorders and parasomnias, but nothing fit. This was not a known affliction. This was something other. My desperation led me to a man, my late grandfather, an avid collector of strange antiquities, had once mentioned, Mr. Alistair Finch. He owned a small, dusty shop in the oldest part of the city, a place wedged between a modern vape store and a laundromat, a relic from another time. The sign above the door simply read Finch's Curiosities. The bell on the door announced my arrival with a dry, asthmatic jingle. The shop was a dragon's hoard of forgotten things, maps of places that never existed, strange surgical tools, taxidermied, animals with one too many eyes, an old man with a cloud of white hair and spectacles thick as bottle bottoms emerged from behind a mountain of books. This was Finch. I presented the stone without preamble, placing it on his clotted glass counter. He picked it up, his initial expression one of polite, professional boredom. Then his face changed. He hefted it in his palm, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Remarkable," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle of old paper. "The density is incorrect. It feels like lead, but it's clearly some form of volcanic glass. And yet, it's not obsidian or onyx. I've never seen anything like it." He took it to a workbench in the back, subjecting it to a series of tests with loupes and small scientific instruments. He confirmed my suspicions. The material was unknown, its molecular structure impossibly tight, but it was the shape that truly captivated him. "This is not a natural formation," he stated, his voice now laced with a feverish curiosity. "This is carved. And this symbol, this triangle, it's a foundational glyph. Very, very old. Pre-Sumerian. I've only seen it in obscure, mostly discredited texts on proto-mythology. Leave it with me, young man. I need to consult some of my less public archives." I left the shop feeling a new kind of dread. The mystery was no longer just mine. It had roots that stretched back into the dawn of human history. For 3 days, I waited, the absence of the stone in my pocket, a phantom limb. The nightly journeys continued, the exhaustion deepened. On the third afternoon, Finch called. His voice on the phone was stripped of all academic curiosity. It was tight, strained, and filled with a fear that mirrored my own. "The texts call them the Shapers or the Builders," he said, his voice a low hiss. "A cult, or perhaps a species, that believed reality itself was a malleable substance. They worked with what the manuscripts call the Stone of the Void. They believed that by carving these glyphs, these resonant keys, they could create architectural structures that were not just buildings, but engines. Engines designed to alter physical laws." There was a long pause. "Mr. Thomas," Finch continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the texts are fragmented, but they all agree on one thing. The project was never finished. They say the builders just disappeared. But they also say that if the final glyph were ever to be carved, it would not just open a door. It would create a resonant cascade. It would make the entire structure permanent. Whatever this stone is a part of, it is a piece of a machine of cosmic significance. You must not go back there." His warning came too late. That night, I set up the camera as usual, but I had nothing to leave as a tracer. The stone was gone. I fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. When I awoke, the exhaustion was absolute. It felt like my very soul had been put to work. The handprint on the pillow was darker, more defined than ever. I rushed to the laptop. The footage was the same as always. My other self rose, walked to the wall, and vanished. For hours later, it returned, dusty and weary. But this time, it did not go straight to bed. It stopped in the middle of the room. Its eyes remained closed, but its head slowly, deliberately, turned, angling directly towards the hidden camera on the bookshelf. It knew it was being watched. A faint, dry, whispering sound emanated from its lips. A sound like sand and wind, a voice layered with 100 other identical voices. And this chorus of my own sleeping self spoke a single, chilling phrase into the silence of the room. The architect requires more stone. The architect. The word hung in the air of my apartment long after I had closed the laptop, a pronouncement from a nightmare that had just acknowledged my existence. My other self, my nocturnal slave, was no longer just a sleepwalker. It was a messenger, and the message was a demand. The cold, academic fear ignited by Mr. Finch's research now flared into a raw, personal terror. I was not just a cog in some ancient machine. I was a conscious part of it, a tool that was now aware of its own horrific purpose. The knowledge was a poison. That day, the world began to feel thin, fragile. I would look at the walls of my office building and see, just for a second, the faint, ghostly outline of the triangular glyphs etched into the concrete. The low hum of the city's traffic would sometimes resolve into the familiar, deep, resonant hum of the voidstone. The barrier between my waking reality and the cavern of my sleep was beginning to dissolve. I was terrified of what would happen that night. Would my other self come for me? Would it drag me through the wall? What did more stone even mean? I called Finch, my voice a trembling, desperate whisper. I told him what the creature on the video had said. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the frantic rustling of pages. "The architect," he murmured, his voice laced with awe and horror. "It's not a god, it's the design, the blueprint. A sentient architectural consciousness that directs the work. And if it needs more stone, dear God, it must be close to completion." He told me to get out of my apartment, to go somewhere public, to surround myself with people. "Don't sleep," he warned, his voice cracking with urgency. "Whatever you do, do not fall asleep." I took his advice. I spent the evening in a 24-hour diner, a brightly lit island of greasy comfort in the dark sea of the city. I chain drank bitter coffee, my leg bouncing under the table with a nervous energy that drew stares from the other lonely patrons. But as the hours ticked by, the exhaustion from weeks of unremembered labor began to weigh on me like a physical shroud. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead. The drone of the diner's ventilation fan began to sound like the hum of the stone. The checkered pattern of the linoleum floor seemed to shift and writhe, forming the familiar, angular GLYPHS. My mind was losing its grip. I knew I was about to pass out. In a final, desperate act, I paid my bill and stumbled out into the pre-dawn chill. I wouldn't make it home. I ducked into a dark alleyway, my back sliding down the rough brick wall until I was sitting on the grimy pavement. I would sleep here, in the dirt, in the cold, away from the portal in my bedroom. It was a flawed, desperate plan, but it was the only one I had. As my consciousness finally gave way, a final, horrifying thought surfaced. What if the portal wasn't just in my wall? What if After all this time, the portal was me. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of a garbage truck. My body ached more than ever. My hands were scraped raw, covered in a mixture of grime and the familiar black dust. I had not escaped the work. I had simply changed the location of the exit. I scrambled to my feet and looked at the brick wall I had been sleeping against. There, at shoulder height, was a perfect black handprint, a stark, accusing sigil on the weathered red brick. My heart seized, but it wasn't the handprint that made my blood run cold. It was what was next to it. Scratched into the brick, fresh and deep, was a single, perfectly formed, triangular glyph. I hadn't just gone to work. I had brought the work with me. I was no longer just a builder. I was a missionary, spreading the silent gospel of the architect. The glyph on the alley wall was a brand, a declaration. The work was no longer contained within the secret, subterranean world of my sleep. It was bleeding into the streets of my city. I spent the day in a frantic, paranoid haze, walking the city aimlessly, convinced I was being followed, not by a person, but by the architect's silent, geometric influence. Every crack in the pavement looked like a nascent glyph. The skeletal framework of new construction sites seemed to mimic the impossible, non-Euclidean angles of the ziggurat in my dreams. Was I going insane, or was I the only one sane enough to see the world being rewritten? My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Finch. His voice was a panicked, breathless whisper. "Turn on the news, son. Any channel." I ducked into an electronics store, my eyes locking on the wall of televisions, all tuned to the local news. The headline was "Unexplained Geological Anomaly Baffles Experts." The footage showed a city park not far from my apartment. In the middle of a green, manicured lawn, a perfect 50-foot cube of the same black, obsidian-like stone from my dreams had materialized overnight. It was smooth, featureless, and absorbed the morning light, a block of pure darkness that defied all geological explanation. Police had cordoned off the area. Scientists in white coats were swarming around it, their instruments giving off bizarre, nonsensical readings. The architect had requested more stone, and my nightly self had delivered. I fled the store. The image of the colossal block burned into my mind. I was an unwitting accomplice to an invasion, a silent, cosmic terraforming of my own world. The exhaustion I felt was no longer just physical. It was a deep, moral weariness. The fatigue of a man whose body was being used as a weapon against his own species. I had to see the cavern again. I had to know how close they were to finishing. That night, I didn't fight the sleep. I welcomed it. I set up my camera, but this time, I also prepared a small backpack. Inside, I placed my phone, a powerful flashlight, and a small, sharp chisel from my toolbox. If my other self was a builder, then I would become a saboteur. I lay in bed, and as the familiar, heavy wave of sleep washed over me, I focused my entire waking will on a single, desperate intention: to remember, to stay aware, to become a lucid dreamer in the nightmare of my own creation. I plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was not in the cavern. I was standing in my own bedroom, but it was a perfect, dark replica. The sleepwalker version of me stood before me, its eyes closed, its face a placid mask. It held out its hand. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. A silent voice echoed in my mind, the now familiar chorus of my own layered whispers. The architect has seen your awareness. It is pleased. It invites you to see the work, to understand your purpose. My other self turned and stepped through the wall. I knew it was a trap, but it was also the only path forward. My hand closed around the chisel in my pocket. I took a breath and followed him through the veil. The journey this time was different. I was not alone. The sleepwalker acted as my guide, moving through the spiraling tunnels with a graceful certainty. It did not look back, but I felt its awareness. Of me, a cool, constant pressure in my mind. We emerged into the vast cavern. The change was staggering. The ziggurat was nearly complete. It towered into the darkness, a monument of impossible geometry, its surface now covered in thousands of glowing glyphs that pulsed with a soft, internal light. The army of my doubles worked with a frantic, feverish energy, their movements faster, more precise. They were placing the final capstones on the upper levels. But the most terrifying change was the central block I had been tasked with carving before. It was now raised on a pedestal at the base of the ziggurat, an altar, and lying on top of it was the small, triangular stone I had taken to Mr. Finch. My guide led me to the foot of the ziggurat, stopping before the altar. The 100 other versions of me all paused their work, turning their closed-eyed faces towards us in silent unison. The humming from the structure grew louder, a resonant chord of imminent completion. The voice entered my mind again, no longer a whisper, but a clear, commanding broadcast. The keystone requires a final resonance. The architect requires a willing hand. The waking mind must join the sleeping hand. You will complete the work. You will carve the final glyph. You will make us permanent. My other self stepped forward, picked up a carving tool, and held it out to me. The choice was clear. Refuse, and they would surely destroy me. Comply, and I would doom my own world. I stood before the altar, the carving tool held out to me by my own silent, sleeping double. The collective gaze of 100 versions of myself pressed in, a psychic weight of pure, unified expectation. The humming of the ziggurat vibrated in my bones, a song of imminent, terrible creation. The voice of the architect echoed in my thoughts, a silken, compelling logic. You are not destroying your world. You are perfecting it. You will bring order. You will bring purpose. You will bring permanence. It showed me images, visions projected directly into my mind. Cities of silent, perfect geometry, a humanity that moved in synchronous, efficient harmony, a world without chaos, without dissent, without pain, a perfect, beautiful, silent tomb. My hand trembled as I looked at the tool, then at the keystone on the altar. My mind raced, searching for an escape, a third option in a binary trap. The chisel in my pocket felt heavy and useless. What could one man's tool do against a mountain of impossible stone? Sabotage was a fool's errand. But as I looked at the keystone at the altar, an idea sparked, a thought so insane, so steeped in a logic not my own, that it could only have been born in this place. The architect needed a willing hand, a conscious mind to join the sleeping one. It needed my consent, my participation to bridge the final gap between the dream world and the waking one. The materialization of the block in the park was not a full-blown invasion. It was a leak, a consequence of the barrier thinning. To make the entire ziggurat permanent, to bring the full structure into reality, it needed me to complete the circuit. What if I gave it what it wanted, but not in the way it expected? I took the carving tool from my other self. Its hand was cool and smooth, like polished stone. I turned to the altar, my heart a frantic drum. The army of my doubles watched, their purpose singular, The architect's presence in my mind was a triumphant, expectant hum. I did not place the tool on the keystone. Instead, I turned it in my hand, gripping the sharp, obsidian point. I looked at my own reflection in the polished surface of the altar, a pale, terrified man in a world of silent, purposeful monsters of his own making. I had been carving their glyphs onto their stone. It was time to carve my own glyph, on my own medium. With a scream that was both defiance and surrender, I plunged the sharp stone tool into my own left hand, pinning it to the surface of the altar. An explosion of pure, white-hot agony shot up my arm, a pain so real and so vivid it completely overwhelmed the dreamlike state of the cavern. The psychic hum of the architect shattered into a discordant, shrieking feedback of pure shock and confusion. The connection was not expecting this. It was not expecting pain. It was not expecting. It was an act of chaos, of inefficiency, of a logical, human desperation that its perfect, orderly mind could not process. The 100 versions of me all flinched back as one, their serene expressions for the first time breaking, replaced by a ripple of confusion. The glowing glyphs on the ziggurat flickered and dimmed. I had introduced a variable it could not understand. My own pain was a virus in its perfect system. Through a haze of agony, I looked at the keystone. The final glyph was meant to be a perfect, self-contained triangle. But now, my blood, dark and real, was flowing from my pinned hand, tracing a new, chaotic, imperfect line across the stone's surface, corrupting the sacred geometry, rewriting the final command with my own suffering. The architect's psychic shriek of confusion was a physical force, a wave of pure static that threw me back from the altar. The stone tool was ripped from my hand, clattering to the cavern floor. My hand, now free, was a mess of blood and agony, the pain a searing, white-hot anchor to my own consciousness. The cavern was in chaos. The army of my doubles staggered and twitched, their synchronized grace shattered. Some clutched their heads, their closed-eyed faces contorted. Others simply stood, vibrating, their forms flickering in and out of solidity. The glowing glyphs on the ziggurat strobed, erratically shifting from their steady hum to a sickly, discordant pulse. I had not broken the machine, but I had thrown a wrench in its gears. My blood on the keystone, my act of illogical was a piece of data it could not pass, and the entire system was struggling to process the error. The voice in my head was no longer a calm, commanding broadcast. It was a fractured, overlapping chorus of fury and pain. Error, unforeseen, variable. The pattern is corrupted, the resonance fails, pain is inefficient, data purged the anomaly. My sleepwalking guide, the first of my doubles, turned its gaze towards me. Its placid, closed-eyed face began to contort. The skin tightened, the jaw unhinged, and the mouth opened impossibly wide, emitting a silent, digital scream. Its hands, elongated, the fingers sharpening into black, obsidian claws. The architect was no longer trying to control me. It was trying to delete me. It was turning its own workforce, my own reflections, into weapons. The other doubles began to change, their forms twisting, their limbs stretching into unnatural, predatory angles. They were no longer builders. They were antibodies, a host of identical nightmares turning on the foreign cell that had infected their system. I scrambled backwards, my injured hand held to my chest, a hot, wet mess of pain. I was trapped in a vast cavern with 100 versions of myself that now wanted only to tear me apart. My desperate gamble had not won me my freedom. It had only changed the nature of my executioner. I fled, stumbling back towards the tunnel from which I had entered, the sound of 100 pursuing footsteps, my own footsteps, echoing behind me. As I ran, I saw the cavern walls begin to destabilize. My act of defiance had not just confused the architect, it had wounded the very fabric of this dream space. Great fissures of pure white light, like cracks in reality, spiderwebbed across the dark earthen walls. The ziggurat itself seemed to groan, pieces of its glyph-carved stone crumbling to the floor. The entire dimension was coming apart at the seams. I plunged into the relative safety of the spiral tunnel, my monstrous doubles close behind. I could hear their dry, whispering voices, no longer a chorus, but a cacophony of garbled, furious threats. I did not know if the portal back to my room would still be there, or if I was now just a rogue program. A ghost trapped between two collapsing worlds, hunted by my own reflection. I scrambled up the tight, spiraling tunnel, the sound of my monstrous pursuers echoing from below. The air in the passage was thick with the smell of ozone and something new. The scent of burning electricity, as if the very code of this place was being overloaded. The walls of the tunnel, once solid earth, were now translucent and shimmering, revealing the chaotic, glitching data storm beyond. I could see fragmented images of my own apartment flickering within the walls. A tantalizing glimpse of the reality I was so desperate to reach. The tunnel exit appeared ahead, a perfect, dark circle against the tunnel's shimmering instability. I threw myself through the opening without a second thought, landing hard on the familiar, solid wood of my bedroom floor. I was back. The transition was jarring. The oppressive silence of the cavern was replaced by the faint, distant drone of city traffic, a sound so mundane it was beautiful. For a moment, I lay there, gasping, my body screaming from the exertion, my hand a throbbing nexus of pure agony. The relief was so profound it was paralyzing. Then I heard a dry, scraping sound from the wall behind me. I rolled over, my heart seizing with a new wave of terror. The wall, the portal, was still open. It rippled like a heat haze, the plaster seeming to melt and reform. A single, clawed obsidian hand pushed through the surface, its long fingers scrabbling for a purchase in my world. They were following me. The architect was not content to let me escape. It was trying to force its way through the wound I had created. I scrambled away from the wall, my mind a blank slate of panic. I looked around my room for a weapon, for anything. My eyes landed on the small, triangular stone that Finch had returned to me, sitting on my nightstand where I had left it, the stone that was meant to be the keystone. I remembered Finch's words. Resonant keys, a machine to alter physical laws. The stone was not just a piece of their world. It was a control key, a component of the machine itself. A desperate, insane idea formed in my mind. The stone resonated with the cavern, with the ziggurat. What if I could use that resonance not to build, but to close? As another one of the creatures, another twisted version of myself, began to force its head and shoulders through the plaster, I grabbed the stone. It was humming violently now, vibrating with a power that made my teeth ache. I ran towards the wall, towards the emerging monster. It turned its closed-eyed face to me, its mouth opening in a silent, hateful snarl. I didn't hesitate. I jammed the triangular stone directly into the center of the rippling, unstable plaster of the portal. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The stone flared with a blinding white light, and a deafening low-frequency tone erupted from it, a sound so powerful it shook the entire apartment building. The creature screamed, a real, physical sound this time, a shriek of digital feedback and tearing reality. The portal collapsed in on itself, sucking the monster back into its own dimension with a sound like a giant vacuum being switched on. The wall solidified, the plaster dust settling. It was over. The portal was closed. And then I heard sirens. Not in the distance, directly outside my building. The sound I had made had not gone unnoticed. The wail of sirens grew from a distant cry to a building-shaking roar. Red and blue lights flashed through my window, painting the walls in frantic, strobing colors. I stood in the center of my room, my chest heaving, the triangular stone still clutched in my good hand. It was no longer humming. It was inert and cool to the touch. The portal was closed, but my ordeal was far from over. Heavy, authoritative footsteps pounded up the stairs in the hallway, followed by a fist hammering on my apartment door. "NYPD, open up," a voice shouted. I was a cornered animal. How could I possibly explain this? The bloodied hand, the state of the room, the impossible sound that had just rocked the entire neighborhood. They would think I was a madman, a bomb maker. I scrambled for a plausible story, my mind a frantic mess, but there was none. My reality was no longer compatible with the one outside my door. They did not wait for an invitation. A heavy ram splintered the door from its frame, and two police officers in heavy tactical gear burst in, their weapons raised. They froze, their expressions shifting from hardened professionalism to pure, baffled disbelief as they took in the scene. I must have been a strange sight. A pale, gaunt man, half naked, clutching a bleeding hand and a strange black rock, standing in a room that smelled faintly of ozone and dust that did not belong to this world. I dropped the stone and raised my hands, a gesture of universal surrender. The next few hours were a blur of cold, clinical procedure. I was taken to a hospital, my hands stitched and bandaged by a doctor who looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I was questioned by detectives, their faces impassive masks, as I spun a desperate, flimsy lie about a gas canister exploding. A story that crumbled under the barest scrutiny. They knew I was lying. They had found the strange, black dust in my room. They had seen the odd, triangular scratches on my wall. They had the stone dot. My salvation came from an unexpected source. A quiet man in a nondescript grey suit arrived, flashing a badge that did not belong to any law enforcement agency I recognized. He dismissed the detectives with a few quiet, authoritative words. He introduced himself only as a consultant. He sat across from me in the sterile interrogation room. He placed the triangular stone on the table between us. "The architect requires more stone," he said, his voice completely calm. My blood ran cold. He knew. He looked at me, his eyes holding, not malice, but a weary, profound understanding. "You are not the first, Mr. Thomas," he continued. "This city is built on foundations much older than brick and steel. We have been monitoring these materialization events for decades. A block of stone in a park, a strange glyph on a subway wall. We are a quiet organization dedicated to cleaning up the messes, to maintaining the quarantine. You have done something no one has ever done before. You closed a portal from this side. You have their attention, and more importantly, you have ours." The consultant, who never gave his name, laid out the chilling reality of my situation. The organization he represented had existed for over a century, a clandestine group of scholars, scientists, and soldiers. They were the true custodians of the world's most dangerous secret, that humanity was not alone, and our reality was a fragile, permeable membrane. They referred to the architect's realm as a parallel architectural consciousness. They had documented its attempts to build its way into our world for generations, treating the incursions like a slow-moving geological threat. My experience, my nightly work, was the most significant breakthrough in their research. I was the first known subject to physically enter the architect's realm and return, the first to interact with it directly and survive. I was a walking, breathing data log, a Rosetta Stone for a language of impossible geometry and cosmic intent. My lie to the police was irrelevant. I was not going to jail. My old life, my small apartment, my lonely job, they were gone, erased as surely as if the defrag protocol had claimed them. I was now a person of interest to the only people on Earth who could understand my nightmare. He offered me a choice, though it was no choice at all. I could be classified as a threat, a rogue element, and spend the rest of my life in a comfortable, secure, and inescapable containment facility, where I would be studied until the day I died. Or I could join them. I could use my unique, terrifying connection to the architect. I could become a consultant myself. Your other self is still a part of you, Mr. Thomas, the man in the grey suit explained, his voice devoid of emotion. The architect's directive is still embedded in your subconscious. Every time you sleep, you will go to work. We cannot stop it, but we can direct it. We can give you the tools. We can send you to other breach points. You can become our first line of defense, or our most valuable research subject. The choice was between a gilded cage and a leash, between being a lab rat and being a hunting dog, sent back into the very nightmare I had just escaped. I now live in a quiet, comfortable room in an undisclosed underground facility. It is not unlike my old apartment, but the walls are thicker. There are no windows. Every night, they prepare me. They attach sensors to my head, place a small modified version of the keystone in my hand, and brief me on my target. A new glyph appearing in the Paris catacombs. A strange energy reading from a remote Siberian forest. Then I go to sleep. I am their explorer, their saboteur, their scout in a war no one else knows is being fought. I walk the dark, impossible corridors of the architect's realm, but now I walk with purpose. I map its tunnels. I study its builders. I sabotage its constructions when I can. But every time I am there, I feel the architect's presence. It's cold, calculating consciousness, watching me, learning from me, adapting to me. And every morning, I wake up to the same familiar exhaustion, the same deep, aching pain. And I reach over and place a single, black, dusty handprint on the clean, white pillowcase next to me. Not as a signature from a monster I can't control, but as a report, a single, silent message to my keepers that I have returned from my nightly work, and that I have survived one more day as a spy in the house of gods.